For those who have joined us, you're very welcome. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes just to ensure that everyone who intends to join us is with us. So we will commence in the next couple of minutes. So you're very welcome to the annual report launch, Thresholds 2020 report. And as I say, we'll commence in the next few minutes. So just to say to people who are joining us, you're very welcome. We will just wait for the attendees to come through from the waiting room, and then we'll start in earnest in a minute or two. Thank you. So elected representatives, funders, donors, supporters, colleagues in the statutory and voluntary sectors, Threshold staff and board members and guest speakers, you're all very welcome to Threshold's 2020 annual report. This report celebrates the work, the effort and the impact of Threshold staff and board over what was a very different and a very challenging year for all of us, not least families and people in the private rented sector. I'm privileged to be hosting this launch today. We warmly welcome Bob Jordan, CEO of the Housing Agency and a previous CEO of Threshold. The work of the agency is key to driving thought and policy across the housing tenures and is a central player in the delivery of Housing for All. Our chair, Aideen Hayden, will introduce Bob a little later. We also welcome Yvonne Magner, Assistant Manager in our Dublin region, who will be speaking about her experience at the front line of assisting, advising and advocating for and on behalf of tenants and with tenants as part of our work in our tenancy protection and advice services. And Yvonne will speak about how we make a positive difference in the lives of people and families who rent. We're very pleased to start this morning's launch with a recorded video message from the Housing Minister, Darragh O'Brien. The Minister will set out the policy commitments in which Threshold's work operates, including commitments related to Housing for All. The Minister's input will then be followed by our chair, Aideen Hayden, who will then present. Aideen will be followed by Bob, and Yvonne will provide the last input. Following our speakers, there will be brief questions and answer session. So please do ask questions using the Q&A facility provided on Zoom. I will now hand over for the Minister's input.
Díomh go léir a cordide gur míle maithbh as óchtán deisio ó thuirtum tuairisciúil bliantúil Threshold 2021 a cheola aniu. I'd like to thank you sincerely for the opportunity to launch Threshold's 2021 annual report. Just a month ago, we launched Threshold's Own Your Rights campaign, a vitally important initiative that encourages tenants to be aware of their rights and benefit from all the protections and services available. But I know Threshold's story began much further back. For over 40 years now, you've worked to prevent homelessness, providing advice and advocacy to vulnerable people and those facing social inclusion, and you've continued to do so in this year, 2021. Threshold's vision is an Ireland where everyone has access to affordable, secure, suitable, and good quality housing. And that's my vision too. In September, I published Housing for All, the government's new housing plan to 2030. The key objective of which is that everyone, and I mean everyone in the state, should have access to a home to purchase or rent at an affordable price, built to a high standard and in the right place, offering a high quality of life. If you've had the opportunity to read the plan, you'll see that affordability and rental protections and social inclusions are absolutely at its core. Like Threshold, I want to see an improvement in the situation for renters here in Ireland, and we're making strides in this regard. I do not want to see tenants facing unaffordable rents. That's why we now have in situ our first cost rental homes, availing of rents which are up to 50% below the open market rate. My plan is to significantly scale up this delivery. 18,000 cost rental homes will be provided by 2030, averaging 2,000 per year, which in my view will be a game changer for rent affordability in Ireland. As a matter of priority, I'm in the middle of legislating to cap rent increase to 2% per annum in rent pressure zones. And the bill also includes a really key commitment in Housing for All to address long-term security of tenure through the introduction of tenancies of unlimited duration. I hope to have the bill enacted actually in the coming weeks, and the rent cap will apply immediately, providing more security for the vast majority of renters in the country. In terms of social inclusion, we're working towards a vision of an age-friendly Ireland in which older people can live long and healthy lives and participate in their communities. For people with a disability, we're working to deliver a range of housing types in order to promote equality of opportunity, individual choice, and really importantly, independent living. Quality and quantity of traveller-specific accommodation is also a priority, and I'm working very closely with local authorities and Minister Peter Burke to increase and improve the output of traveller-specific accommodation. I have to say I am very proud to have signed the Lisbon Declaration on behalf of this country, which tasks me and my colleagues to eradicate homelessness by 2030. We take this pledge very seriously and are working on a number of measures which are outlined in Housing for All that will continue the positive progress we've made in recent years. There will always be those, our most vulnerable, for whom, for a myriad of reasons, the state must provide ongoing support. And that's why we're expanding our Housing First programme over the next 5 years to support a further 1,200 tenancies. We've seen such encouraging results from this programme, and I believe that this is one of the key pillars in the government meeting our commitment in the Lisbon Declaration. Of course, Housing for All acknowledges that the way to address homelessness and improve affordability is to build more homes. Over 300,000 new homes will be built by the end of 2030, including 90,000 social homes, 36,000 affordable purchase, and 18,000 new cost rental homes. Backed by historic levels of investment, with in excess of 20 billion through the Exchequer, the LDA, and the Housing Finance Agency over the next 5 years alone, it's the largest state-led building programme in our history. It's ambitious, but it can be done. I'd like to finish by taking a moment to acknowledge the staff and the board of Threshold, who are continually adapting their work and their practices in response to the pandemic, and are continuing to excel in providing essential services. I thank you, and the government thanks you for the vital role that you play. As I said previously, we share the same vision, and we work to deliver Housing for All. I hope that we can continue our close working partnership in building a sustainable, affordable, and equitable housing system that works for everybody.
So many thanks to Housing Minister Darragh O'Brien for his support and affirmation of Threshold's work in what was, of course, the 2020 annual report. Our chair, Aideen Hayden, will now present our annual report. And as many of you will know, Aideen's a solicitor, former Labour Party senator, and is adjunct professor at the UCD School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice. A graduate of Economics and History from University College Dublin, Aideen qualified as a solicitor in practice from 89 to 08. She was a board member of the RTB, the PRTB as it was then, from 04 to 11. Aideen served as a senator from 2011 until 2016 and was Labour Party Shannon spokesperson on housing, children and youth affairs, and vice chair of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform. Dr. Hayden also received a PhD in housing policy from UCD in 2014 and is a member of the boards of the Housing Finance Agency and the Property Services Regulatory Authority. Aideen, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Don Mark. First of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for attending earlier today with us for a photo call and a chat, and to thank him very much for his contribution to this web launch of our annual report. I mean, we had hoped, of course, that we would be doing this in person, but unfortunately, like a lot of other organisations, we've been forced back again onto the web and onto the Zoom. So I'd like to thank you very much for being here, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking all of our amazing staff for the way they've handled the very difficult situations that we've been in since the outbreak of COVID. And working on the front line is always difficult, but it's clearly been even more so since COVID and over the last 2 years. As John Mark said, we're going to be hearing from Yvonne Magner, who's one of our frontline managers. And I think you'll see how much our staff care about what they do and the work that they do. And Yvonne will be giving very much the frontline perspective. Bob Jordan will also be speaking with us. As many of you will know, Bob is a former CEO of Threshold, former director of Housing First, a former government advisor, and he's recently been appointed as CEO of the Housing Agency. So I think from every perspective, not just of Threshold's work, but of the housing system generally, Bob is well placed to advise all of us on where Threshold's, particularly Threshold's future, lies in the context of delivering, and particularly in delivering on preventing homelessness and housing for all. So I'd like to start by talking about the extent of Threshold's work in 2020 and what we achieved. We assisted 18,707 households. We worked on over 20,000, almost 21,000 individual cases. We carried out 116,000 individual actions. We identified and worked with 11,306 households at risk of homelessness. And we directly prevented, and I think this is really worth emphasizing, 5,173 households, and that were 7,121 adults and 4,026 children from entering homelessness. We answered almost 50,000 calls, and having set up web chat in August of 2020, we answered almost 4,000 web chat queries. I think what this demonstrates is that in 2020, a very significant number of people benefited from good quality, independent, expert advice offered by Threshold to people who were confused by what was happening, unsure what rights they had under the new legislation, worried about losing their deposits, worried about not being able to pay their rents, and just plain worried. And what we saw was the benefit of quick action, not just in terms of getting appropriate advice at the right time, but also action from government in relation to moratoria on evictions, which led to a significant drop in homelessness figures, for example, and demonstrated how important security is for tenants and how good, sound, robust enforcement of measures can, in reality, protect tenants from homelessness. We saw that willingness to act by government to protect renters in their homes. We also saw changes that were also significant around enabling people to access financial help. For example, the rent supplement scheme was made easier to access in that period. So there have been a number of very significant changes over the period of COVID, changes which we hope will be lasting in the housing system. As the Minister said, we've also seen some changes that are forthcoming. We've seen new legislation being introduced in relation to limits on rent increases, initially limiting them to the consumer price index, for want of a better word. But when it became clear that inflation was an issue, the Minister came forward with legislation to link inflation to CPI or to a maximum of 2% rental inflation. We're also seeing legislation which will deliver on indefinite tenancies. Now, some of these measures are, we could certainly suggest improvements to the Minister, but they are very welcome. One thing I would say, though, in relation to our experience of COVID and 2020 and the measures that were introduced, a very significant number of those measures were temporary measures. And by the end of those measures, we had 1,000 households who continued to face eviction into 2021. And today we are currently dealing with almost 3,000 cases of threatened eviction overall. So the risk of homelessness is very real. What has been demonstrated is that there are ways to deal with the threat of homelessness, and that good solutions can come out of bad circumstances. And it is important to hold on to the flexibility that we have had since the COVID crisis began. The problem, though, is that renting in Ireland, remains it's an uncertain place to be. And in spite of all the many improvements that we've seen in the last year, and I'm going to come back and maybe to some of those improvements, many problems remain, and there are still many, many families at real risk of homelessness. We face a very significant shortage of housing, as the Minister has said. We have 1,500 units available to rent in the entire country, and we're seeing annual rent increases of around 7% in spite of restrictions. Now, you might argue that's an improvement on the 10% that we were seeing a number of years ago, but it's still beyond the means of many people, particularly people who are accessing our services. The main issues tenants faced who came to Threshold in 2020 were eviction. And the biggest cause of this is and remains the fact that landlords are leaving the rented market and selling. Other issues were and still are issues around leases and standards and repairs, rent increases and retention of deposits. Debt is also an issue. I mean, many people in Ireland during COVID were able to save substantial sums of money, but many were not. And particularly people in the rented sector who were very vulnerable. And we know from our own work, people particularly in the hospitality sector found themselves in real risk of accumulating substantial debt in that period and are still recovering from that situation today. Now, as I said, COVID has certainly helped in changing the rented sector. We saw 4 specific pieces of legislation relating to moratoria on evictions and rent freezes, for example. And this was, I suppose, an unexpected benefit and perhaps has helped lead on to some of the more major changes we've seen recently, such as limiting rents to the Consumer Price Index, which was a change that Threshold has asked for over a very long period of time. As I said, what's proposed is not perfect. For example, we know that there's a huge growth of rents outside rent pressure zones, in large part due to people moving to locations outside of our cities. We do see, though, that there are some commitments in housing for all that will be of significant benefit to tenants, particularly around standards of BER effectiveness and so forth. Almost a half of all tenants live in properties today that are below a C rating. And we now see people, working from home who are on low incomes who have to heat and maintain their properties at quite a significant cost. At our annual report launch, we like to look to the future as well. And there are longer term wins, hopefully, for rented sector, for tenants in the rented sector over the next number of years. And in particular, I'd like to point to some of the measures in Housing for All to assist people into home ownership and to look at the new cost rental model, which is already delivering homes. Our tenant sentiment survey in 2020 showed that the reality of the matter is that most tenants don't want to be living in the rented sector. Only 26% of all of the people we surveyed in our 2020 survey were in the rented sector because they wanted to be. And the reason for that is because the sector is still unaffordable and it's still insecure. In spite of the positive changes, the reality of the matter is that limiting rent increases or even introducing rent freezes will make no difference when the rents are unaffordable for renters in the first place. Over 60% of our clients want to own their own homes. Therefore, improving access to home ownership is a very big priority for them. It is still shocking to think that it is substantially cheaper in Ireland today to pay a mortgage than it is to rent. Our clients too are getting older, and the Minister referred to the need for appropriate housing strategies for older people. 36% of our clients are over 35 years of age. And affording a roof over your head as you head into retirement is a significant challenge, but increasingly that is what we are seeing through our services. The introduction of cost rental is a very significant move for threshold clients, and it's most welcome and will make a big difference. I think people need to understand what cost rental is, and it's a system where rents are linked to the cost of housing provision and not what the market will bear. And that will mean, as the Minister said, 2,000 properties per year, which will be delivered at rents that are up to 50% less than market rents. But the challenge, I think, is to make sure that we will get enough cost rental housing in significant numbers for it to make a real difference. And I think that there need to be other answers as well as the positive initiatives we've seen under Housing for All. We would like to see new proposals coming from the Commission on Housing, for example, that will complement current policy and provide more solutions in relation to affordability in the rental market. Solutions that perhaps are operating in other jurisdictions and maybe of assistance here to us in dealing with the issues that we face. But just going back a moment now to the major problems that we still have in the rented sector, in spite of some of the improvements. First, in relation to the enforcement of legislation, we have made great strides in some areas of legislative change, but enforcement still remains an issue. Threshold have sought a public rent index so that tenants will be in a position to actually enforce the rights that they have. Another area that is of great concern to us relates to the housing assistance payment. Many of Threshold's clients rely on the housing assistance payment. The limits for the housing assistance payment haven't changed since 2016. HAP tenants are finding it increasingly harder to find somewhere to live. The reality, and we know this from numerous surveys that we've done and work that we do with HAP tenants, many HAP tenants pay top-ups to landlords way and above what the rental cost of the property is. And that means that they are doing without basics such as food and clothing in order to be able to put a roof over their heads. They are in reality social tenants, but they don't have the benefits that other social tenants have, and they certainly don't have the security. Housing for All has promised a review of HAP payments, and we think it is a major priority that this area be dealt with if we are to tackle risk of homelessness and in particular, sincere risk of poverty. Shortage of properties to rent is a critical issue. There are, as I've already said, 1,500 properties to rent in Ireland at the moment. And in terms of rents, the average rent in Dublin, according to Daft, is heading for €2,000. We do face a major problem with the loss of landlords in the sector. And with 1,500 properties only to rent in Ireland, last year alone, 4,224 landlords left the market. And that's according to RTB data. And while small landlords still make up the bulk of the market for renting, roughly about 80%, institutional investors are increasingly important. And they now constitute almost 40% of the entire housing market in Ireland. This is driven by many factors, but largely by the requirement for apartment construction. Apartment construction is more expensive, for example. There are fewer developers who can handle this type of development and so forth. So costs tend to be higher for these type of units. And what has happened is these units or developments have been sold en masse to institutional investors. I mean, this would not be news to most of the people who would be watching this webinar today. The private rented sector is a huge growth area for institutional investors. There is a role, of course, for institutional investors in the housing market, but there is a difficulty here in that we are losing small landlords who are providing housing in different types of housing all over the country, and they are being replaced by institutional investors who are in the main delivering housing in our cities and delivering in the main apartment developments. And just for example, why this creates a difficulty for threshold clients. A new development of build to rent near where I live, which I passed on my way in here today, which is under construction with some of the units finished. A studio is renting for about 1,600, a one bed for 1,800, a two bed for 2,200 upwards, and a three bed for up to €2,700. €700. There are many people for whom this is affordable, but there are many, many more for whom this is not. And if new supply into the market is going to be driven at these type of rents, we will face a major problem for middle and lower income families. For example, the HAP limit for a single person is around 550. So €1,600 for a studio is just in the stratosphere for people who are in that situation. And given, as I said, that the majority of new housing in the private rented market is going to be coming from institutional investors, I think we need to take great care to guard against a two-tiered private rental market system where we have haves and have-nots. And we need to guard against cities of the future where the physical divide is stark and indeed where even homeowners on more modest incomes are becoming confined to marginal to buying housing in counties around our main cities, for example. So we are relying on cost rental to deliver affordable housing. It is really the principal way forward for people who are using threshold services, but this will be a challenge. The number of units to be delivered under Housing for All is 2,000 units a year. In yesterday's paper alone, for example, I saw planning permissions granted for 1,200 units in Baldoyle for private rented sector housing. Last week it was 1,600 in Drumcondra, and so it goes. There are announcements of large institutional investments every week in our papers. And it is difficult to see, even though these units contain Part 5, where the majority of affordable private rented units will come from in the future, remembering that the entire cost rental programme is 2,000 units a year. At this level, it's hard to see the affordability problem solved sooner rather than later. And I would ask the Minister to continue looking harder at increasing the delivery of cost rental units as we go forward. And it's particularly important that we don't unwittingly create ghettos of the future, even if they are ghettos of privilege, and that we do keep a good stock of affordable housing for all mixed income and mixed tenure communities in our towns and in our cities. What we need to see is real security and affordability for those who rent, no matter who they rent from. We need to see real options to move on to home ownership for those who want to, as we see that many of Threshold's clients do. And we want to see fairness in schemes such as HAP. We want to see similar terms for HAP tenants as we see for people in mainstream housing. I would just finish by saying, remember that COVID is not over yet. And what we've seen only too clearly, and we must not forget this, is that the most vulnerable people are living in rented housing. Threshold, I believe, has shown very clearly in our 2020 annual report and in the work that we do, the value of preventing homelessness, and that it is critical that we continue to do so into the future. So I would like to thank all of our staff, all of our board and our funders, and all of the people who make the work that we do possible. And I would like also to thank everyone who has made today's lunch possible. Many thanks. I will hand over now to Bob Jordan.
Thanks, Aideen. Hope everybody can hear me. I suppose the first thing to say is it's always nice to be to know that you're welcome in your old parish. I'd like to thank Aideen and John Mark for the kind invitation to speak today, and obviously I'd like to say hello to the staff and board members of Threshold, and indeed all the colleagues in the housing sector that are on here today. Just to say as well, there's quite a number of former Threshold staff working here in the housing agency, and I suppose for me as CEO of the housing agency, it's really obviously it's good to see people staying in the housing sector, but also bringing that hands-on practical experience of working with people affected by housing problems into an agency that's involved in advising government on policy and helping to design programs that hopefully make lives better for people. And the housing agency's role is really to make the housing system work better for everyone. I suppose the minister mentioned cost rental earlier, and we're involved actually in cost rental at 3 levels. We've been involved in the policy design in terms of the Affordable Housing Act. We were involved with Dublin City Council on the Vienna model housing exhibition, obviously, showcasing cost rental from Austria. We're involved in terms of as a lender in terms of providing cost rental equity loans to approved housing bodies to actually deliver cost rental. And indeed, the second call for CREL loans just ended yesterday. So we're hoping, when we get through all of that, that there could be 600 to 700 additional cost rental homes coming under that call, and there will be an open call in the new year. And finally, at project level, we've actually been involved in transferring land to Dunleary Rathdown County Council from the land aggregation scheme, which has been developed by Tuath and Respond into cost rental homes in Enniskerry Road and Stepaside. So very much working at all levels. As you know, the Housing Agency also has a role, along with the RTB, in relation to making recommendations to the Minister on rent pressure zones. We're very much involved in the promotion of mixed tenure developments, sponsoring research such as that carried out by Aideen Hayden and Michelle Norris in relation to clustered and dispersed housing. I'll talk a little bit more about cost rental, and we'll also be involved in the new Town Centres First initiative, which is really about bringing vacant properties, both residential and commercial properties, in the centres of towns and villages back into use that obviously can be turned into rented accommodation. And I suppose, our biggest area of work at the moment would be in relation to affordability, in relation to the various affordable schemes, the First Home Equity Scheme, the Affordable Housing Fund, and indeed looking at the viability of apartment developments in city centre areas under the Croí Cónaithe scheme. So in terms of threshold, I think, like the Minister mentioned, the Lisbon Declaration, and there really is only two ways to deliver on the Lisbon Declaration in terms of eradicating homelessness, and that's preventing people from becoming homeless in the first place and exiting people who are currently homeless into permanent housing and giving them supports if they need it, such as that under the Housing First programme. And just to say that, in a way, Threshold has been a pioneer in both of those areas. Like, I remember the Access Housing Unit being established back in 2003 to help exit people from emergency accommodation into the private rented sector, long before the Housing First initiative started. And really, there was a lot of skepticism, I would say, at some, at stages in the past in government around homeless prevention. I guess there was a feeling that maybe every good deed prevented homelessness, and it was a little bit nebulous to put your hands on exactly what kind of tangible effect measures could have. Now, actually, Threshold, with the advice of the late Simon Brooke, that a lot of people will know, internally worked on a paper and a mechanism to look at how you could focus homeless prevention. It really ended up focusing in on people at immediate risk of eviction. And then, Threshold pioneered the responses with the Department of Social Protection, such as the interim tenancy sustainment protocol, which essentially allowed people a little bit more flexibility in rent supplement in order to remain in their homes. And that kind of flexibility has transferred across to the HAP scheme in terms of homeless HAP and so on. So really, Threshold has been a pioneer in terms of homelessness prevention. And I suppose when I worked in the Dublin Region Homeless Executive, we were very interested in getting a pilot program off the ground to look at single persons at risk of homelessness, because while there's, obviously quite rightly a lot of talk about family homelessness, the reality is the majority of people are homeless or single people, about 4,500 people. Any work that can be done in that area really prevents people from having long stays in emergency accommodation. So I'm very pleased to see in the report the success of the pilot in terms of preventing about 100 clients from becoming homeless. In terms of the annual report itself, like, reading the report is really quite interesting, and there's no question that Threshold has been in the front line of saving homes. 2020, there's no doubt, was a year of extremes in many different ways, but a year of extremes for Threshold's clients, in terms of, renters essentially being the people in the employment categories that were most affected by the public health measures, losing their jobs, really feeling the brunt of the pandemic, and under a situation where, there are high rents, low rental supply, landlords leaving the market, really a perfect storm. And I suppose, in a way, a perfect storm for an organization like Threshold quickly had to adapt, move online, use new technology to remain in contact with tenants. And I just want to congratulate Threshold on doing that so well. In terms of, just the broad figures, 50,000 calls, 19,000 households helped, But I think the most important figure, to go back to what I was talking about, 5,000 households, 11,000 people prevented from becoming homeless. If you think about the, just over 8,500 figure, closer to 9 now, people are homeless. Imagine if those 5,000 households were added to that figure. So that's the kind of impact the threshold is having. And essentially, threshold has been saving homes. Threshold staff have been saving homes from their own home and adapted to doing that during COVID, which, as Aideen has quite rightly said, is not over yet. And obviously, as Aideen has said there as well, some good solutions have come forward during COVID to keep people in their homes in terms of moratoria on evictions, rent freezes. And as Aideen has quite rightly said, that is carrying over into mainstream policy now. I think in terms of Housing for All is a different document to its predecessor, but the private rented sector is really important in it, but it's a more cross-cutting document. I think Aideen has mentioned some of the measures, but certainly the extension of rent pressure zones until 2024, the new regulation of short-term lettings. The minister is obviously working on legislation around tenancies of indefinite duration, in the enforcement of registration with the RTB, really important, minimum building energy ratings, increased inspections of standards, an examination again of the deposit protection scheme, and obviously cost rental homes, which Aideen has quite rightly said needs to be delivered at scale. And it's maybe something I just want to talk about a little bit now. Just to say, I do want to pay tribute to colleagues from the past as well. Rory O'Donnell and NESC. I mean, there was a very interesting report produced by NESC back in 2004, Housing in Ireland Performance and Policy, which really championed cost rental. So what's great for us here in the agency here is to be part of the delivery of the first actual cost rental homes. Cost rental, like very rarely are people in the housing sector around for the birth of a new housing tenure, but that's what cost rental is. And we're only at the beginning of that journey, there's no question. But I suppose what makes it, and Aideen has explained it very well, but what makes it different is the rents are essentially delinked from market rents. And they're based on the cost of the provision, management and maintenance of the homes. Cost rental itself can be a destination as well as a pathway. A destination in terms of giving people secure, affordable, long-term tenancies over time, which is for many people a choice. But it can also provide a pathway to home ownership because people can save more money if they're paying more affordable rents. I think for the approved housing body, including threshold, there's an opportunity there. I mean, AHBs have up to now been involved in delivery of social housing. They can now deliver more units because they can deliver a mix of both social housing and cost rental and be part of promoting and delivering mixed tenure communities. And obviously, the goal here is to get to a situation where we have enough cost rental homes in Ireland that it has a moderating effect on overall rents, as it has done in other countries. And in fact, the Housing Agency will be publishing a study soon, produced with Housing Europe, looking at, I suppose, cost rental in other jurisdictions such as Finland, Denmark, and Austria. And basically, cost rental, there's no one perfect way of delivering cost rental, but really what it's about is using every lever to keep rents low, low-cost loans, low-cost land, grants, equity, and really efficient management and maintenance of properties. And obviously what we're involved in doing here in the Housing Agency is really helping to shape and develop a cost rental model that's most appropriate for Ireland. And as part of that, the Housing Agency is now a lender, as I mentioned previously, under the first cost rental equity loan call. 35 million has been provided to deliver 390 homes, a further 70 million in 2022 to deliver 600 or 700 homes. And actually, from early 2022 or onwards, there will be an open call for cost rental equity loans. And we hope that many more providers will come into play there. I suppose in terms of the long range view of the private rented sector, like if you look back to the 1990s, the sector was largely unregulated with the exception of the 1992 Act around rent books and around minimum standards in 93. But essentially security of tenure was a huge issue. From the Commission on the Private Rented Sector in 1999 to right now, there's been a huge leap forward in terms of regulation of the sector, in terms of security of tenure, in terms of regulation of rents, in terms of many things to do with the private rented sector, but we still know there clearly are problems in terms of affordability, in terms of supply, in terms of security. And as Aideen has said, and I think this is true, so we now have a commission on housing. And we really would hope that that commission on housing would come up with blue skies thinking on affordability, including in the private rental sector. Clearly, cost rental has a big part to play in that. In terms of new directions for threshold and indeed the private rented sector, as Aideen has quite rightly said, there are about 61% of people in the private rented sector have said that they have an aspiration towards home ownership. Can we create pathways to that? Cost rental is one in a way, but also perhaps rent to buy schemes. And then obviously looking at the expansion of the supply in the rented sector going forward, and what role threshold can play in that, including in terms of cost rental. I suppose finally, I would just like to, I'd like to pay tribute to Aideen actually, because this is her last annual report launch as Chair of Threshold. I don't need to tell any of you who know Aideen that she's a force of nature, somebody who's very passionate about housing, but I think more importantly, passionate about the people who are affected by housing problems and coming up with real solutions for them. She's been Chair of Threshold, as has been mentioned already, a member of the board of the Residential Tenancies Board, the Housing Finance Agency, a member of the board of the Property Services Regulatory Authority, many years on Dublin City Council SPC. She's a lecturer, a researcher, a solicitor, and a former senator. And I suppose the one thing that I've learned from Aideen is that you can only really change policy in an area where you really know the experience of the person on the ground. And I think that's what has marked out Threshold actually as an organisation, that the solutions have come, the proposed policy solutions have come from the direct experience of working with people affected by problems in the private rented sector. So I just want to wish Aideen well. I want to wish Threshold well. And I also want to really thank you for inviting me to be part of the annual report launch. Obviously, I was part of many annual report launches in the past. And just to mark and acknowledge the incredible work that the staff and board of Threshold are doing in terms of preventing people from becoming homeless in the private rented sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob Jordan, and thank you for the introduction to Aideen Hayden. As she said, my name's Yvonne Magner and I'm the Assistant Manager in the Dublin service. And I'd just like to thank you all for giving me the time to speak and to describe the experience of working for Threshold in the Dublin office. We've experienced a plethora of new challenges over the last year, from continuing to work remotely to adapting to the new and unique issues faced by clients and all renters in Ireland. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, we've experienced an increase of calls, emails, and dispute hearings. The advisors in Threshold offices have adapted to restrictions with an admirable level of flexibility and determination. We can see this by the implementation of a web chat function, as well as the option of booking a one-to-one consultation with an advisor online. This has allowed advisors to continue to connect with clients on such a personable level while remaining apart, and most importantly, keeping our clients and our staff safe during these uncertain times. This personal connection is what I believe the advisors working with Threshold really strive for. With the launch of an annual report, we're provided with an insight into the bigger picture. With a report as concise and comprehensive as this one, it's clearly demonstrable what an impact Threshold makes. Our advisors have represented some of our most vulnerable clients in formal hearings. We've assisted clients in facing a language barrier to navigate what could otherwise be confusing or intimidating systems, and we've acted as mediators between landlords and tenants. Most importantly of all, we've saved many tenancies from breaking down and provided stability and certainty for clients on the brink of facing homelessness. But having said all this, the bigger picture is not always the priority for an advisor on a day-to-day basis. I can speak not only for myself, but for many of my colleagues when I say that it is the human connection that motivates us to always provide the best possible experience to every single person who picks up the phone or writes us an email in their more vulnerable moments. All of us in Threshold have the knowledge of housing policy to protect tenancies and to fight for the rights of tenants. These are skills that we've learned, but the skills that our advisors are born with are the ones that set them apart. This is because our callers do not only require advice. When people call threshold, they also need to be met with empathy, kindness, calmness, and with compassion, characteristics that all of our advisors possess in abundance. These simple gestures can put a person at ease in a situation that may otherwise appear hopeless. An example that comes to mind for me is one of the first calls that I ever received after beginning my position with Threshold. The caller was in the throes of a disagreement with their roommate. They did not at first appear upset and simply wanted some information clarified around their rights as a joint tenant within a house share. And truth be told, I was relieved to receive such a straightforward call so early into working on the helpline. But as he elaborated, it became apparent how distressed this caller was beneath the calm exterior. I soon realized how distressing it must be to have your day-to-day life belittled by a person you are in constant contact with. This hit home as the client mentioned working remotely. I couldn't help but worry that these disagreements were the client's only face-to-face interactions, given the nationwide restrictions at the time. I provided the client with my extension line and an email address and encouraged them to call me with any further queries. We spoke a few more times. Each time he had simple, straightforward queries. After each issue was resolved, the client wrote me to thank me for my help. And as he put it, show his appreciation for the work that Threshold does. He described how he had been put at ease, knowing that there would be a person at the other end of the phone who would decipher issues which seemed difficult at first. He also described how his anxiety over the situation eased after each phone call. Anybody who begins working with Threshold will tell you how focused they are on providing the correct advice. But reading this letter, I realized that to a client, hearing that this is manageable and I'm here to support you is just as important as any legislation. Another example is a client who came to us at a time when she was, unfortunately, terminally ill. She was facing a lengthy process and understandably would prefer to spend the precious time that she had left with her family and loved ones instead of locked in a dispute. Through the work of Threshold and through mediation, she was able to settle her case with her landlord and to spend her time on what mattered most to her at such a vital stage. Some cases may seem at first more trivial than cases like this one, but they are just as important to the client who is impacted. I worked some time ago with clients who are facing eviction. Furthermore, their client was asking that they get rid of their dog, a beloved family pet. To them, being separated from such an important family member was an even worse prospect than the threat of homelessness. They treated their pet as well as they treated any of their children and couldn't bear the thought of rehoming him. Again, by fighting for their rights and explaining their priorities and their family structure, we not only saved the tenancy, but the landlord agreed to allow them to keep their dog in the house. In their eyes, their tenancy had not only been protected, their family had also been kept together and allowed to live in peace as a whole unit. As we already know, stability of tenure is one of the key areas of our lives which we depend upon to feel safe and secure. But with these stories in mind, we can remember that not all issues faced by tenants are as seemingly big as the threat of eviction. In some cases, the most important thing is to ease the anxieties of a tenant and to allow the person the opportunity to live in peace and with dignity and to know that they are supported. We are able to support people to not only face their tenancy issues, but also to not allow these issues to consume their whole lives. For this reason, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our funders and anyone who has donated to Threshold on behalf of myself and my colleagues. This report has demonstrated the myriad of ways in which you are making it possible for us to protect tenancies. I hope that I've been able to give you an insight into the ways in which you have made it possible to protect the people within these tenancies and to provide them with support, to make a meaningful connection and to make an impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thanks to Bob and Ivan. I just want to maybe just underline a couple of things there. Thanks to Bob. You were mentioning there Threshold been a pioneer long before Housing First was established concept or indeed activity. And Threshold responding last year to the year of extremes that kind of stuck out for me. So thank you for your words. Likewise, Ivan, you've provided a real insight and quite a kind of a profound insight into the challenges facing people in the private rented sector who are also facing some incredible personal challenges as well. and the positive and lasting difference that you and indeed Threshold as a whole can make. So thank you very much, Ivan. So during our launch, we have received a number of questions, so I'll go to them shortly. And I just want to, before I kind of close off, so I suppose the first question that came through from Colette Bennett was, how does the housing agency envisage the application of the profit return element of cost rental as currently drafted affecting rent? So Bob, if I may turn to you.
So John Mark, I hope I'm answering the right question, but I'm assuming that what is meant is that after the 40-year period, there could be some surplus money there. And I suppose what we would be expecting is that that would be reinvested in cost rental in order to continue to deliver more cost rental units and keep rents lower over time. As I said earlier, the most important thing is that we use all of the levers available to us, whether it's land grants, low cost loan financing or equity, to ensure that cost rental rents over time are kept as low as possible. Hope that answers the question. And if it hasn't, Colette, it's bob.jordan@housingagency.ie.
Thanks very much, Bob. So the other is just more a thank you from Dermot Lacey in terms of the work that we do. I might just kind of I suppose maybe one to Aideen. I mean, I suppose you're very experienced, Aideen. Your experience knows no bounds in the housing area. I mean, what do you see as I guess the short to medium challenges in relation to housing and the rented sector more generally? You know, are there things that maybe are on the margins right now that might be more of an issue come the next couple of years, the next 5 years?
I suppose the reality, John Mark, is that, you know, the Housing for All programme does contain some, you know, good measures in terms of enhancing options for people who are renting. It's not going to be an instant solution, and I think that is a really, it's going to, I honestly feel the next couple of years are going to be tough. I think it's going to be more important than ever to protect tenancies. I think something needs to be done in order to ensure supply that is affordable. I mean, obviously cost rental will come into play as time goes on, but I mean, I do think we need to look at the fact that, you know, 4.5 heading towards 5,000 landlords are leaving the sector, and you know, there are issues there, and there must be ways in which those properties can be taken into use, either bought directly by local authorities for the sake of argument, with tenants in situ. I mean, that's always been a major problem. You know, when a landlord is selling for the sake of argument, you know, there's a big incentive to sell without a tenant being in situ, and that causes major problems. And at a time when we can't really afford to have one single property in the country vacant, you know, it causes enormous difficulties. So I think we need to be a lot more inventive about how we are bringing supply into the market. I think also, and this is more of a, I suppose, a blue skies issue, we're pursuing a form of development that is kind of, certainly for cities and towns, where we're going denser, but by going denser, we're going up. So it's kind of, you know, now minimum 6, 7, 8 stories. That's cutting out a lot of potential development, I think, you know, in terms of sort of mid-range developers and so on. I think we need to be maybe looking and saying, can we achieve these densities by not necessarily going up? And I think that might bring a lot more supply into the market quicker, because it would allow smaller developers to be involved. And again, you know, I suppose really just to answer your question, I don't I see hope, but I see that hope taking 3 to 5 years to materialize. And I think there's going to be a major task there for organizations like Threshold to continue to work to keep people in their homes, really, at the end of the day. And just to say, yeah, I do think we need to leave no stone unturned in terms of bringing what we can into the housing market. And there are measures there that are, you know, around, for the sake of argument, empty units, bringing them into the market. And I think we need to look a lot more closely at how we can incentivize delivery towards people on lower incomes. What can be done to I mean, we can all see where the institutional investors are going. I mean, their model is very clear cut, but I think we need to see a lot more around how we can incentivize delivery to lower income groups and to middle income groups, because, you know, the days when, you know, Threshold's clients were predominantly all on you know, depending on social welfare. Now it's what, 40% of Threshold's clients are working. So, you know, that I see as a big challenge. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Aideen. And we actually have a number of questions here, so I'll just be really brief. I'll just put them out simultaneously. So one is, can anyone shine some light on why provision of publishing rents was not incorporated into the RTB at its inception?
Could I quickly answer that? Yeah.
Please do, Aideen. Yeah.
The excuse publishing rents has always been GDPR, okay, but the Property Services Regulatory Authority publishes the property price register, okay? So I can go online and I can look and see what the house up the road for me sold for. I really see no good reason at all why we cannot have a rent register. And if we are going to have really robust regulation, proper enforcement really of the regulation that's there, you do need to have a transparent rent register. And you know, I think it just has to be done. It's a bit like the deposit protection scheme. We know that so many people risk homelessness and risk losing, you know, for people on lower incomes, like a deposit these days can be tipping €2,000. And, you know, these are very big amounts of money. And, you know, these issues can be easily solved. And again, it goes back to, I suppose, the referendum on housing, for example, you know, putting the right to housing in the Constitution. Sometimes I think these type of technical issues are sort of used as excuses. And so that's why I do think it is important that, you know, we start prioritizing housing and delivering solutions. So yeah, there is, in my honest opinion, no really good reason we don't have a rent register at all.
Thanks, Aideen. And just one for Bob, I think, are there initiatives being considered by the Housing Agency to ensure where AHP properties are non-compliant with the Housing Standards for Rented Housing Regulations 2019? There's an implication on funding. Just a word on that.
Sure, John Mark. So just to clarify that the voluntary regulation office in the Housing Agency will come to an end at the end of this year, and statutory regulation will take over by the AHB regulatory authority. So probably it's a question that needs to be directed for them, but you will have seen that they produced their draft standards recently, and property and asset standard outcomes are part of that. So maybe it's a question that would need to be directed to ABRA, but certainly standards are very much, obviously, including in relation to property assets, are very much in there.
Yeah, and that's the approved housing body regulatory authority. Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. Well, look, I mean, I'm conscious we're a couple of minutes to the past. So the last thing for me to do is host is to thank you all for your attendance and your participation. Crucial to work is our funding from statutory bodies and private donors, and without which we couldn't operate. So our staff can't do what we do without the support of the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, Cork City and County Councils, and Kerry County Council, Galway City and County Council, the HSE, Department of Social Employment Affairs and Social Protection, and Pubble's scheme to support national organisations and the Citizens Information Board. And it's critical that statutory income enables Threshold to continue to respond to various challenging issues. And we sincerely thank all our funders for their investment in our work, because that's what it is. And in addition, the generosity of our donors and our supporters, some of you are here today, and that means that we're better placed to provide appropriate responsive services to tenants. I wish to thank our committed board for their time, expertise and energy that they bring to leading the strategic direction of Threshold in 2020 and ensuring that the organisation does indeed fulfil its mission in a responsible and responsive way. And I think in this regard, I want to take the opportunity to personally thank Aideen for all of her insight and her support during my 5 years of being CEO. And Aideen is clearly a leader in the housing field, and just a very passionate campaigner for the rights of people who are on the margins of our housing system. And just to offer you that special thanks for the support and the guidance and the leadership that you've provided, and that I'm sure you will provide in all manner of fields and spaces in the next chapter. So just to thank you and to thank everyone for attending today and for marking and celebrating with us the impact that we've had during 2020. Thank you.